when we think about dignity, we often think about two different concepts of dignity. One, where we think of dignity as a status held by nobles or aristocrats, a kind of high status that one has. A second concept of dignity that we often encounter is dignity as a property of our humanity, dignity as something universal. Perhaps that's because there's a spark of the divine in the human. Perhaps that's because of our capacity to reason. Whatever it is, dignity is something that is inherent in our humanity. So these are two familiar concepts of dignity, but one of the things I try to do in the book is listen to critiques and challenges that come from activists and that come from social movements. And one of the challenges that we've heard in recent years is that dignity and respectability have been confused in the way that we've used them. Dignity and respectability are not the same thing, and in fact, they could be opposites, right? So drawing on that insight, I wanted to uncover a third concept of dignity, one that we find in social movements, one that we find in Black freedom struggles in the US, but also more broadly in anti-colonial struggles tied to race. So this third concept of dignity that I suggest has often been overlooked is one where dignity is found in struggle against domination. We find this concept in, as I mentioned, Black American traditions, going back to Frederick Douglass, but also through all sorts of thinkers, from Angela Davis to Martin Luther King and beyond. And this concept of dignity, this third concept of dignity, dignity as struggle, has an aspect of universality to it, in that we are all, in some ways, struggling against domination in our individual lives, in our collective lives. And systems of domination are all around us, and to live and to have a voice, we have to struggle in some way. So there's a sense of universality to this third concept of dignity, but there's also an aspect of the sense of nobility to this third concept of dignity. There are those who have more or less of it, right? There are those who have purport to have dignity, those in high places who might seem as if they're dignified, but actually just have a hollow notion of dignity, which is really merely respectability. Whereas those who are struggling from below have a three-dimensional sense of dignity that is greater in quantity, even as dignity is universal. At least that's the argument that I make in the book. And I want to say that all three of these concepts of dignity circulate today, and the third has been overlooked. We ought to pay more attention to this third concept of dignity. The argument about Blackness that I make is in dialogue with recent scholarship around Afro-pessimism and other new trends in the field of Black studies. Recent Black studies scholars have argued that Blackness is qualitatively different from other forms of racism and from other forms of oppression. Some of this claim comes out of empirical data in the US and beyond, that claims that while other racial groups have over time assimilated and gained economically and in various other ways into a sort of mainstream culture, Black subordination has remained more or less the same over a long time, even as it has taken different forms, even as anti-Black racism has manifested in different ways over the years. In a global context, we might think of this as Africa having a different sort of status than the disadvantage that, say, Latin America or Asia might have had over time. Right, so this is a sort of strong claim that Afro-pessimists and other new Black studies scholars make. And the claim further, the philosophical part of it, is that that Blackness is not about skin color or genetics or culture, but it's something deeper, something ontological. So I want to say that this is getting at something. This is getting something right? That, but the language of ontology is rather mystifying, and a clearer language is just to think about Blackness as a paradigm of domination, or as the paradigm of domination. If we think of domination as the capacity of one to exercise his will arbitrarily over another, then it's sort of arbitrary rule, paradigm of domination, then slavery is what domination in laboratory conditions. And Blackness is best understood as this sort of paradigm of domination. And so it is, as a paradigm, it's different from other forms of oppression. And yet, if we want to learn about other forms of oppression, we have to study domination in laboratory conditions. That is, we have to study Blackness. So that's the argument about Blackness. And then finally, the argument about philosophy is that, or one of the arguments about philosophy is that too often philosophers start with ordinary language or intuitions, and doing that gets things wrong and invests our energy in the wrong places, the wrong directions. Because our language and our intuitions are so infested with systems of domination, with anti-Blackness, with patriarchy, with forms of class domination and others, colonial domination as well, our language and our intuitions will always be taking us in the wrong direction. And it's not enough just to turn to marginalized communities to say, oh, the language and intuitions in marginalized communities gets things right, and we ought to learn from those communities. My argument is that we ought to start by turning to social movements that are struggling against domination. So there's an authority in the struggle against domination, because that's a site where we get the clearest view of the concepts that matter to our lives, concepts like love and anger and family and friendship. All our ordinary language and intuitions about those concepts is deeply contaminated by systems of domination. It's only by turning to those struggling against domination that we can get whatever clarity is possible on those concepts. And so philosophers ought to be working to sift through and refine and dialogue with social movements that are struggling against domination as their starting point. So that's a brief overview of the book, and I'm looking forward to Dr. Molefe's questions and dialogue.
Thanks a lot, Vincent, for that. It really made my work easy. Look, I think as I want to start by making three points. I'm not sure there are questions, but I just want to make 3 points. The first one is about African philosophy and Black dignity, what you might call Black philosophy. I mean, one of the things that makes a book interesting and powerful is its ability to stand as a critique and challenge certain assumptions that we've made. And one of the things that really struck me about the book is how it revealed a weakness in African philosophy. So we draw a distinction between Africana and African philosophy. So I generally work in African philosophy. So one of the weaknesses that the book has exposed, about me and the work I do and African philosophy in general. So if you think about leading African philosophers, Kwame Jeje, Kwasi Wiredu, and many of them, if you think about them and the way they engage the subject of African philosophy, while at least we work with a concept of Africa and our content, we say it's about Africa, what your book has revealed to me in a very powerful way is the absence of Blackness in our engagement about Africa. So what has really happened here, which I think is unfortunate, which I think your book has helped me to think about, and also, try to help me rework my ideas, is that a more fruitful way is to think about the synergy, it's going to be a complex one between the intersection between Blackness and Africa and Blackness, which is natural. But the biggest problem here has been that the imagination of what philosophy is when it comes to Africa, already it's influenced by the Northern community, and the performance of Black scholars within it, they're beholden to the norms and standards of that world. And what we do, even when we handle topics within Africa, we want to have conversations that are not African, or even if they are African, these conversations are serving an exogenous interest, which doesn't speak to the Black condition. Let me give you an example of this that's very interesting. One of the biggest debates in African philosophy has been about the political theory of Afro-communitarianism. That entire debate has been about rights, But one of the things that's missing in that particular domination is this concept that is central in your work, that many Black, in fact, majority of Black people in Africa live under conditions of domination. And this domination plays itself in different ways. And instead of talking about that domination, we're talking about rights. We want to get access to rights, right? So I found this to an encouragement to think about the intersection of Africa and Blackness. And I think that will, for me, working in African philosophy will enrich my discourse and my work in African philosophy. So I'm very grateful for this kind of work. I mean, important books and useful books are those that keep us thinking about what we're doing, intellectually and in practice. And that's the first thing I wanted to point to. And I'm grateful for that. The second thing that really caught my attention is the question that I've always struggled with. Who's Black? Who is Black? I've always struggled with that question. And my discomfort with this question begins also in South Africa when I'm reading Biko, when I'm reading Stephen Bantu Biko. Right? So Stephen Biko made a claim that has never settled with me, comfortably. The claim that Black consciousness is a combination of two properties. The first property is that you must have pigmentation of being Black. And the second one is that you must have an attitude. And the content of this attitude, the attitude of loving yourself as a Black person, and also of reacting and fighting against everything that oppresses you. Right? If you've got those two features, then you are Black, or you're Black conscious. If you don't have these two features, you're not Black, according to Steve Biko, at least my reading of him, you are non-white. So Blackness is a state where you're fighting domination. Not only are you Black, look, I've never been comfortable about that. And one of the things that your book does very well is really gives what I think is a much more comprehensive, complex understanding of what Blackness is. Because the condition of being Black is a priori. You don't choose. You find these systems of domination at place. Right? Whether you have an attitude or no attitude, there's domination at place. There are forces that are working against you. Right? And immediately, there's a kind of reaction you're going to do. Whether you want to respond at a small scale of mere survival, or you want to be organizing and trying to fight this thing directly in a more robust way. But either way, you're already trapped in this domination. So the idea of constructing a Blackness as you've just described it, as a paradigm of domination, essentially as a paradigm of domination, has got the beauty of revealing its universal dimension, that all of us are struggling with systems that we found in the world, and in that struggle, we're trying to make meaning, and we're trying to, so I found that to be a very important move, which I think many of my brothers and sisters working in the Black consciousness movement in South Africa can really benefit to work with a much richer concept of what it means to be Black and how to think about meaning in Blackness. Now, this is where my interest is, the concept of dignity. Let's go there. So the way you constructed Black dignity, you as you've just done now, you identify these two constructions of it. So think of it first as a status, or think of it secondly as an internal feature, quality, right? That those two conceptions. And they say, no, must think of it rather as a performance in a world of tragedy. This tragedy is domination. And this struggle against this domination is what is the essence of dignity. But what's interesting about this performance, is that its content is the process, not the telos. It's not what you achieve that makes it dignity. It's what you do. The very activity of engaging the world of domination, resisting, organizing, is what constitutes this dignity. I found that to be very interesting. But the question that I started struggling with, is why not think of dignity then? The description sounds like a person who's engaged in this struggle is doing something that has got content. But I think you're afraid to give it content. And the content that you seem to be describing is the language that is too familiar to philosophers. A person who does this, who's struggling in this way, who's exhibiting this kind of courage, who's resisting this undue pressure of domination. One of the ways we could use to describe this person is that this person is virtuous. So it seems that in your interpretation, it's not that it has no content. There is content here. There's a particular kind of character that you're developing. And this character, we don't think of it as virtuous. So I think in my reading of your work, I think one of the ways of thinking of your work is it's a variant of virtue, right? Variant of virtue, where you develop a disposition where you constantly are able to respond to the world that wants to dominate you. And the more you do that, you grow this disposition. And that standard view of dignity as a virtue. And there's a lot of that in the literature on human dignity. There's a lot of that. So it seems to me what is interesting about this view is that it does have an end. It does have an end, and the end is a particular kind of character, a particular kind of disposition. And this character is that of virtue. And what kind of a virtue of this? This is a virtue where you're able to identify a domination and instances of it and systems of it, and you're prepared to resist and to fight that. And the more you do that, you become virtuous, right? So I think the question I had that was to think, so why? So I understand what you're doing, but so it's a process that has an end, but the end you have as virtue. You can always grow as virtue, right? So the rhetoric language is beautiful because it's not finite. You can always be more generous. You can fight more, the more there is. So I think the first question maybe that I want to throw at you to keep the conversation going. Why not conceptualize this in terms of virtue, but just differentiate it from other kinds of virtue interpretations, normative theories? So I think that's the first question I want to throw at you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those great, generous, and very helpful and clarifying remarks and questions. Just to comment briefly on the first two before responding to your very incisive question on virtue. I appreciate the remarks on Africa as object, right? And I think it's something that in a U.S. context we also think about in terms of the specificity of the African American experience, and that sometimes I get frustrated about the where it seems like the philosophically interesting insights from African American thinkers are not about the African American experience, but about domination as such. And that's something that I think we find in the Caribbean, in Césaire or Fanon or others who also have who all have interesting things to say around dignity, and it's great to hear that some of that resonates in the African experience, African context as well, which sort of leads to your second set of remarks, around the what is blackness, or more specifically the blackness in a political sense, right? And I think there's something sort of interesting about our cultural moment that's turning back to circa 1970s account of blackness as political, right? That where there are other things associated with blackness, or culture. There might be questions of land. There might be questions of language or affiliation, but at its heart, right, a question of blackness is one about politics, right? And it's one that's not reduced to the terms of the oppressor, right? It's not just who is labeled Black by those in positions of domination, but blackness, following Biko, who's close to my heart. My first philosophy paper that I published was about Steve Biko. Biko, has this political account of blackness where, it's not just being called Black, but it is embracing and the resistance and struggle that's entailed by blackness, and I think we find versions of that in the U.S. and Caribbean and elsewhere as well. And I think it's helpful to remember that in our current cultural moment, because in the discourse around Black Lives Matter and various sort of global instantiations of Black Lives Matter, there can be both a desire for a political account of blackness, but also some confusion about what that entails, right? And a desire to affirm blackness in what may be more cultural than political terms. Of course, this is a site of great friction in the Black Power movement in the 1970s as well, cultural versus political accounts of blackness. But one of the things that I hope the book can do is contribute to a defense of that political account of blackness that does have some paradox built into it, right? That there is there are some sort of empirical characteristics packed in, and the sort of political account, and somehow they sit together, and that maybe there isn't a way to neatly unpack those, but living into that paradox is something that sort of affirmation of blackness is all about. And naming it in that way, I think, is much less mystifying than the kind of metaphysical or ontological language that we hear coming from the sort of New Black Studies world in the last 5 or 10 years. Now, onto the final set of comments and questions that you made, which are really fantastic and helpful for me to think through. And just to underscore one of the words that you used that I appreciate, is the sort of dignity in a context of tragedy, and that is something that I was trying to think through in this book as well, right? That the domination that is not just by one individual over another, but is systemic, not just one system, but interlocking systems, layers of interlocking systems, right? When one fills out that kind of account of domination, one gets a story of tragedy. And to figure out how to live well in a tragic world, a great philosophical question is one that I think I want to think about, and I want to argue that the Black tradition, and particularly a Black radical tradition, is also thinking about tragedy in a very deep sense, not just tragedy as two goods that you have to choose between, knowing that you're going to lose one, but tragedy in terms of knowing that one's intuitions and language and self are formed by systems of domination, interlocking systems of domination, right? So I want to embrace that sense of tragedy and wrestle with it. Why, and as you rightly pointed out, I'm much more into the sort of language of process rather than telos, right? That it's the struggle against domination itself rather than the result of the struggle that I want to associate with dignity. Whether we can I see where a virtuous character is one way of naming that kind of struggle. To build a virtuous character in this context would be to, as just to quote back to you, is to perceive domination rightly and to respond rightly to domination. That seems correct, and that I want to commend those capacities and call them virtuous. That all seems right. Sometimes in the book I slip into or intentionally embrace an account of the dignity as performed being a kind of friction, right? The systems of domination want to make it seem as if our life in the world runs smoothly, and if we just do what we're told, all will be well. And yet, right, our perceptions and intuitions and self are distorted. If we acknowledge and grapple with those distortions, that creates a kind of friction, and that's where the dignity comes about, by sort of naming and embracing that friction. Virtue language, I mean, I think I worry a little bit about virtue language in that counting the virtues, categorizing, individuating the virtues, coming up with stories about whether you need all of the virtues or some of them, start worrying about those sorts of things. I do think like one can describe love, right, in relationship to domination, as I try to do in the book, as something like virtuous. But the virtue language, I have hesitations about, although maybe you've convinced me that I ought to think more about. I do, one language that goes sort of is paired with virtue language is tradition language, and tradition language is one that I do want to embrace. It sometimes this phrase of the Black radical tradition is sort of thrown around really loosely, and I think we ought to think about that phrase quite rigorously, right, and think about that as a tradition that is struggling against domination, right? That a tradition that is not genealogically linked, not necessarily historically linked, but linked by a shared project to address in the clearest ways the paradigm of domination that is anti-Blackness, understood in this way that I'm trying to give an account to. So naming that as a tradition, participating in that tradition, whether we want to call it virtuous or not, I'm unsure, but I definitely appreciate the push in that direction.
Yeah, sorry, Vincent, I think you're taking all our time. Thanks. But look, Vincent, I think about it very carefully, because so one of the things that strikes me intuitively, like when you talk about that transvaluation, where you talk about, Waldron talks about it, where dignity is expanded to everyone, and the hierarchy is flattened, and everyone is equal. And then you subvert that, and you say, no, you want those who are low, and you want to take them high. And I thought, to me, it struck me, but why? You want to give them a status of nobility. You want to say something about them. And I'm saying, and you're just afraid to put a tag to it, right? You're just afraid to put a tag to it. You're saying these specific individuals that you name there, right? You want us to admire them. You want us to admire them, right? What is it that we're admiring about them? If you would use a term, what kind of moral language would you use to describe those people, right? You're saying dignity, but the question, what is it that makes them dignified that other people will not engage in the struggles that they don't have, right? But let me leave that. I like what you do with the term respectability, right? As a false copy of dignity. But the absence of the concept of respect itself is concerning to me. So typically in the literature on dignity, there's a direct relationship between dignity and respect, right? And I'm worried that you're correct that respectability, which is norms that are provided by domination of who to respect, false copies, right, of dignity. But when we are in that transvaluation, where we see these people who have struggled and who have won, there is this attitude you must have about them, respect. It would have been interesting to see how the concept of black dignity deals with respect as another thing. Let me run quickly to another one. Quickly. The second one is, I'm not happy about how the book deals with the concept of equality. I'm not happy about it. And one wonders if it's possible at all. One of the beautiful things about the concept of status, theoretically and philosophically, or if you take dignity the way it is framed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's an intrinsic feature, and anyone who has that feature is equal to every other. And then when we distribute goods, we've got a clear property that we are tracking. And then the problem is that we're not distributing according to these ontological features that are of it, right? So the problem is not with dignity, the problem is with the practitioners who are supposed to serve. But the question then, I wonder then, you told us that your concept has got universality, in that everyone is struggling with dignity. But the question that I wonder, one of the virtues of this modern concept that Waldron appeals to, where everyone is lifted, that at least now we can explain how everyone is equal. But in this system, one wonders what kind of a substantive idea of equality do you have in mind here? Because even as we struggle, some will struggle more than others. Some struggles, will be more of it than others. So even in that regard, we can never be equal, right? So I was just wondering, what idea of respect does your theory have, and what idea of equality does your theory have?
Thanks. Great questions and big questions. I'll try and just say very little so we can continue the discussion. And on the virtual language, I should say, sometimes I wear a religion hat and sometimes I wear a philosophy hat, and maybe some of my hesitation about the virtual language is that here I'm wearing the philosophy hat, and the language that starts to get into the religion, become close to religion. I worry about. As not appealing to an audience that isn't formed in the vocabularies of and sort of ways of thinking of religious communities, and the sort of language of James Cone, the Black theologian, right, has a strong language about being saved through struggle, right? And the dignity in struggle as a kind of salvation or redemption. It seems like it's sort of above my pay grade in this context.
Maybe just there. But look, you talk about black rage, right? You talk about black love. Those strike me as virtues, right? Those strike me as virtues. So there's no way to run away from it. So virtues are there in the book. The second and third chapter throws these virtues, right? So I think carefully about it. I'm not sure that you can run away from the language of virtues. There might be religious connotations, but here's Aristotle in philosophy who gives a secular account of virtue, right? So I'm saying that kind of escape is not going to work. I'm sorry.
No, I really appreciate the push on that, and it's something I'm going to continue to think about. Just briefly on equality, right? So I mean, there's a sense of equality that I think dignity points to. That is that because of the tragic nature of the world, we are all struggling against domination in different ways. So we all have this sense of dignity, and recognizing that dignity in each other because we are all struggling in different ways. Is a sort of prerequisite for thinking about equality, but I think that equality in any substantive sense, I want to bracket and keep for a sort of eschatological horizon. It's only in a world without domination where there will be equality, right? In the world that we have, with all these layers of domination, interlocking forms of domination, to talk about equality is a tactic or maybe a strategy for the struggle. It's not something that we can achieve, in one step or two steps or 2 weeks or 2 years. It's on that sort of eschatological horizon. similarly with respect, which, as you rightly point out, is deeply connected in the history of dignity with a concept of dignity, and which is a term that does not come up at all in my book, respect. I do think that there's a sense in which to take one concrete example in the book, I talk about Paul Robeson, the lawyer and athlete and singer and activist, and the sense of dignity that is ascribed to him in those various capacities, right? Both as in law and in theatrical performance and singing and so on, but also he attributes to his father, right? This preacher, right, who resists segregation at a very local level in New Jersey, I think in all of those cases, respect and dignity go very closely together for Robeson, right? That by ascribing dignity to his father in his father's resistances to segregation, to this form of American apartheid, there is a respect that his father is worthy, and by naming that dignity, he's calling for a kind of respect that ought to be attributed to him. And similarly, to Robeson himself in these different capacities, right? There is a sort of worthiness of respect because of the forms of struggle, aesthetic, political, legal, etc., that we find associated with Robeson.
Thanks a lot for that. Look, I think maybe I still have a lot of things to say, but maybe we should open up for, but let me pass this. Look, I think this is one of the most elusive books I've read. It challenged everything I've been doing and reading on dignity. It opened a new vista of knowledge for me. I'm working on a paper on African personhood and Black dignity of you, comparing the two. So I think it's a beautiful concept, powerful book, beautiful concept, and I think it's going to open a lot of ways to really challenge the traditional views that are dominant.